My mother-in-law forced me to wear her 50-year-old pearl necklace. At the family gathering, my husband's aunt stared at it in horror. "Where did you get this?" My mother-in-law grabbed my wrist, whispering, "Take it off." Now, I never thought a simple family gathering could send chills down my spine. But then again, nothing about my mother-in-law, Eleanor, was ever simple. "Wear this," she said, shoving a velvet box into my hands as I finished getting ready. Inside, nestled in black satin, was an old pearl necklace. The pearls were smooth but slightly yellowed with age. The clasp was delicate, almost fragile. "It's lovely," I said carefully. A lie. The thing felt heavy, like it carried a history I didn't want to know. Eleanor gave me a tight smile. "It belonged to my grandmother. A family heirloom. It would mean a lot if you wore it tonight." I hesitated. Eleanor never gave me anything. Her approval was like a mirage, always out of reach, no matter how hard I tried. If she was offering me this, there was a reason. But my husband, Daniel, peeked in and grinned. "It looks great on you, babe." And that was that. I fastened it around my neck, ignoring the strange unease curling in my stomach. The house buzzed with voices when we arrived. The Goldstein family was never quiet. Generations of wealth, privilege, and well-maintained secrets filled every grand room. I was an outsider, even after 5 years of marriage. Polite smiles, half-hearted conversations, the unspoken knowledge that I wasn't truly one of them. Then, as I reached for a glass of wine, I felt it. A stare. Aunt Margaret stood frozen across the room. Her face paled. The color drained from her lips. "Where did you get this?" she whispered. I blinked. "What?" She rushed forward, her shaking fingers barely grazing the pearls before yanking her hand back as if burned. "The necklace," she breathed. "That's impossible." A hush fell over the nearby guests. I could feel Eleanor move behind me. Her grip on my wrist was vice-like. "Take it off," she hissed in my ear. "Now." The room spun. My pulse pounded. Something was very, very wrong. I reached for the clasp, but before I could unfasten it, Aunt Margaret turned to Eleanor, eyes blazing. "You told me it was gone, that it was destroyed." Silence. Thick. Suffocating. Then Eleanor did something that sent ice straight through my veins. She smiled. A slow, eerie smile that didn't reach her eyes. And in that moment, I knew I was wearing something that was never meant to see the light of day. Something that should have stayed buried. Something that could destroy us all. My fingers trembled against the clasp, but it wouldn't budge. Aunt Margaret's face contorted, torn between horror and fury. "You swore, Eleanor." Her voice was sharp, cutting through the stunned silence. "You swore it was gone." Eleanor let go of my wrist, straightened her posture, and with that same unsettling smile, she said, "And yet, here we are." Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Daniel stepped closer, his brows furrowed. "Can someone explain what's going on?" His gaze darted between his mother and his aunt. "It's just a necklace." "Just a necklace?" Margaret let out a bitter laugh. "Oh, you poor boy." Then she turned to me. "Did she force you to wear this?" The weight around my neck suddenly felt unbearable. My skin burned where the pearls rested. "She gave it to me," I admitted, said it was a family heirloom. Margaret inhaled sharply. "A family heirloom? Is that what she told you?" Her voice wavered. "My God." I looked at Eleanor, expecting an explanation. She remained poised, her expression unreadable, except for a flicker of something dark, deep in her eyes. Margaret turned to the rest of the room. "Leave. All of you." Her voice carried an authority I hadn't heard before. "This is a private matter." Murmurs of protest. Confused glances. But one look from Eleanor, and suddenly, coats were grabbed, glasses abandoned. People shuffled toward the exit like obedient sheep. Within minutes, only 6 of us remained. Eleanor, Daniel, Aunt Margaret, Uncle Charles, myself, and my father-in-law, Robert, who had been silently nursing his whiskey in the corner. "Someone tell me what's happening," Daniel demanded. Margaret exhaled shakily. "That necklace was supposed to have been destroyed 50 years ago." My breath hitched. Robert finally spoke, his voice low and gravelly. "Because it was evidence." My stomach twisted. Evidence of what? Silence stretched between us like a noose tightening. Margaret looked at me, really looked at me, as if debating how much to say. Then her shoulders sagged, as though a battle had already been lost. "There was a murder," she said, "and that necklace was covered in blood." I flinched. The room swayed. I wanted to rip the pearls off, but my fingers wouldn't move. "Murder." Daniel's voice cracked. He turned to his mother, his jaw clenched. "Tell me she's lying." Eleanor met his gaze with practiced calm. "She's being dramatic." Margaret scoffed. "Dramatic?" She jabbed a finger at the pearls. "That was Josephine's necklace." The name meant nothing to me, but the way Robert winced and Eleanor's smile faltered told me everything. Whoever Josephine was, she was important. "She was our cousin," Margaret continued, her voice tight. "And she was found dead the night before her wedding." A shiver ran down my spine. Margaret pointed at Eleanor. "And you were the last person to see her alive." My heart slammed against my ribs. My mother-in-law's grip on her wine glass tightened. That was never proven. Margaret's lip curled, because the evidence mysteriously vanished. She gestured to my neck, and now it's right here. A sharp, suffocating silence fell over the room. I could hear my own pulse hammering in my ears. Daniel shook his head. Mom, tell me you had nothing to do with this. Eleanor sighed, setting her glass down carefully, almost lazily. Then she stepped toward me, her fingers reaching for the necklace. This conversation has gone on long enough, she murmured. I recoiled. Eleanor's eyes darkened. Her fingers curled. Give it to me. My instinct screamed no. I shook my head. Not until I know the truth. Something flickered across Eleanor's face. An emotion too quick to name. Then, for the first time since I met her, her mask slipped. She wasn't calm. She wasn't collected. She was terrified. And that's when I knew this wasn't just about a murder. It was about something much, much worse. Eleanor's fingers curled, trembling ever so slightly. It was the first crack in her perfect exterior. I said, she repeated, voice low, give it to me. My heartbeat thundered in my ears. I took a step back. Not until I know why you're so afraid of it. Eleanor's lips pressed into a thin line. Her eyes flicked toward Robert. For a moment, they exchanged something silent, a look and understanding. Robert exhaled deeply, rubbing a hand over his face before fixing his gaze on me. You don't know what you're asking for, girl, he said. His voice was tired. Some things are meant to stay buried. Buried. The word sent a chill down my spine. Margaret scoffed, crossing her arms. Of course you'd say that. She turned to me. Don't listen to him. You have no idea how long I've waited for this. My skin prickled. Waited for what? For proof. Margaret's jaw clenched. For justice. The air in the room felt thick, heavy with something unspoken. Daniel shifted beside me, his hand brushing against mine. Whether to reassure me or himself, I wasn't sure. This is insane, he muttered. Mom, if there was a murder, why wasn't this ever investigated? Eleanor let out a dry chuckle. Oh, it was. Her gaze cut sharply to Margaret. And you know exactly how that turned out. Margaret's face twisted with anger. Yes, because you made sure of it. A sudden realization hit me like a punch to the gut. You covered it up, I whispered. Eleanor tilted her head. What an accusation. Margaret's voice was firm. It's not an accusation. It's the truth. She turned to me. Josephine was supposed to marry into a powerful family. But the night before the wedding, she disappeared. 2 days later, they found her body by the lake on our estate. Drowned. A lump formed in my throat. She was wearing this necklace the last time anyone saw her. Margaret gestured to the pearls at my throat. And then, after her body was found, it vanished. Vanished. Just like the evidence. Just like the truth. I glanced at Eleanor. Her face was eerily blank. Daniel swallowed hard. Mom, did you enough? Eleanor's voice sliced through the tension like a knife. She moved toward me again, slower this time. Calculated. Listen carefully, she said. You don't know what you're involving yourself in. That necklace is dangerous. My stomach twisted. Dangerous how? Eleanor's lips parted, then shut. Margaret took a step forward, her voice trembling with restrained fury. Because if Josephine didn't drown by accident, then someone in this family killed her. A tense silence followed. The implication sat heavy in the air. Daniel looked between his mother and his aunt, his expression unreadable. And you think it was Mom? Margaret's lips thinned. I know it was her. Eleanor scoffed. You always needed someone to blame. Margaret's fists clenched. Because it was you. Eleanor didn't flinch, didn't blink, and that terrified me more than anything. She wasn't denying it. I sucked in a sharp breath. Why would you kill your own cousin? Eleanor exhaled, slow and deliberate. You assumed too much. I wasn't sure if she was talking to me or Margaret, but before I could push further, a sound interrupted us. A sharp, rhythmic tapping. Robert had set down his whiskey glass. He was drumming his fingers against the table. Slow, deliberate. His face was unreadable. I think we've had enough for one night, he said. His voice was calm, but something about it felt final. No, Margaret snapped. We're finally talking about it. After 50 years, that's enough. Robert's voice dropped an octave, carrying a weight that made my stomach turn. Eleanor didn't look at him. She simply stepped back, her expression unreadable. Margaret let out a bitter laugh. And there it is. She looked at me, eyes filled with something between pity and determination. You want the truth? She pointed at Robert. Start with him. Robert's fingers stopped drumming. Something passed over his face, just for a second, but it was enough. Enough to make my blood run cold. Because Eleanor wasn't the only one keeping secrets. And somehow, I had a feeling she wasn't the worst of them. Silence clung to the room like damp air before a storm. Robert's fingers had stopped drumming. His expression was unreadable, but something in his posture shifted, like a predator realizing it had been spotted. Margaret's words still hung in the air. You want the truth? Start with him. I swallowed hard, my pulse thudding against my throat. Robert leaned back in his chair, slow and deliberate, eyes flickering between Margaret and Eleanor. Then he sighed. 50 years, he murmured, shaking his head. And still, you just won't let it go. Margaret stiffened. Because she was murdered. Robert exhaled through his nose, as if exhausted by the conversation. You were a child, Margaret. You don't know what really happened. Margaret's face burned red. I know enough. I shifted uncomfortably. Then tell me. All of it. Margaret hesitated. For a second, I thought she might break. Might let fears silence her like it had for decades. But then she squared her shoulders and spoke. I was 13, she began. Old enough to know when someone was lying to me. Josephine was supposed to be getting married, but that night, she told me she was leaving. Running away. I blinked. Running away? Margaret nodded. She was in love with someone else. Not the man our family had chosen for her. She wanted out. A heavy pause. Then Robert chuckled. A cold, quiet, unnerving chuckle. Margaret whipped toward him. You think this is funny? Robert shook his head, but his eyes, those dark, knowing eyes, held something dangerous. I think it's ridiculous. Eleanor stepped forward, arms crossed. Enough of this nonsense. But Margaret ignored her. She was staring at Robert now, fury igniting in her gaze. She came to you, didn't she? The room went still. Robert tilted his head just slightly. What are you implying? Margaret's voice turned sharp. She needed money to leave. Help. And she came to you because you were the only one with real power in this family. Robert's lips curled, amused. So now I'm the villain? Margaret's fists clenched. I remember what you were like back then. Ruthless. Controlling. She told me she was afraid of you. A sick feeling coiled in my stomach. Eleanor spoke up then, her voice eerily calm. Josephine was a reckless girl with foolish dreams. She got herself killed. Margaret snapped her head toward her. You mean she was killed for trying to leave? My chest tightened. By who? Nobody spoke. The question hung in the air like a blade, waiting to drop. Then Robert stood. Slow. Unrushed. As if he had all the time in the world. That's the real question, isn't it? He adjusted his cufflinks, his face unreadable. But you're all so caught up in ghosts and old grudges, you never stop to consider something. He looked straight at me and smirked. What if the real answer isn't in the past? His voice dropped. What if it's right in front of you? A cold dread crawled up my spine. Margaret's eyes widened. What are you saying? Robert didn't answer. He simply turned to Eleanor. Their gazes locked. Something unspoken passed between them. And that's when it hit me. They weren't arguing. They weren't accusing each other. They were protecting each other. A realization settled like lead in my stomach. Eleanor wasn't the only one with blood on her hands. Robert had been part of it too. And whatever happened that night, it wasn't just a murder. It was a cover-up. My throat tightened. Who else knows? Robert smiled, slow and deliberate. Does it matter? A suffocating silence. Then, in the distance, a sound. The faint wail of approaching sirens. Margaret's lips parted in surprise. Her eyes flicked toward me. Daniel's voice broke through the silence. You called the cops? I didn't move. Didn't speak. But I didn't have to, because the truth was already here. And this time, nobody was leaving without answers. The sirens grew louder. No one moved. No one spoke. Robert's smirk didn't waver, but his fingers twitched against his side. Eleanor stood rigid beside him, eyes locked onto mine. Margaret's breath came fast and shallow. Then Robert exhaled, slow and measured. Well, he straightened his cuffs. That complicates things. My pulse thundered in my ears. I wasn't sure what terrified me more. The fact that I had just blown open a decades-old cover-up, or the fact that neither Eleanor nor Robert looked remotely surprised. Daniel turned to me, his voice tight. Did you really call the cops? I forced myself to nod. Somebody had to. Eleanor let out a quiet laugh. Oh, sweetheart. She tilted her head, looking at me like I was a child who didn't understand how the world worked. You think this is going to change anything? A knock at the door. Sharp. Commanding. Nobody moved. Then a second knock. Louder. Margaret was the first to break, her voice barely above a whisper. It's over. Robert's smile didn't fade, but there was something in his eyes, something calculating. No, he said simply. It's not. The door burst open. Two uniformed officers stepped inside, their eyes sweeping over the room. We receive a call, one of them announced. Who's in charge here? For a second, nobody answered. Then I am. Robert. My stomach dropped. The officers exchanged glances. And you are? Robert Goldstein. His voice was smooth even. This is my home. Whatever you were called here for, I can assure you it's a misunderstanding. I opened my mouth, but Eleanor's gaze snapped to me, sharp as a blade. A silent warning. Don't. Margaret stepped forward instead. It's not a misunderstanding. It was a murder, and I can prove it. The officers stiffened. A murder. Margaret pointed at my neck. That necklace belonged to Josephine Goldstein. She was killed 50 years ago, and that necklace, she swallowed, vanished the night of her death. One of the officers frowned, stepping closer to me. Ma'am, may I see it? I hesitated. but then I nodded and carefully unclasped it, my fingers trembling. I handed it over. The officer examined it, his expression unreadable. Then he turned to Robert. Sir, do you have any comments on this allegation? Robert's smile was slow, amused. Officer, I think you'll find that this is a very old family story blown out of proportion. Eleanor stepped forward, smoothing her dress. And I believe you'll also find that there's no evidence tying us to anything. No crime scene, no witnesses, just an old piece of jewelry and some misguided emotions. Margaret's hands clenched into fists. You're lying. Eleanor's smile didn't waver. The officer sighed. Without more concrete evidence, there's not much we can do. Panic flared in my chest. No, no, this couldn't be happening. But then, a voice. Wait, it was Daniel. Everyone turned to him. He swallowed hard, then glanced at me before facing the officers. I know where to find proof. Eleanor's expression cracked. For the first time all night, real fear flickered across her face. Robert turned slowly. Daniel. His voice was smooth, coaxing. What are you talking about? But Daniel didn't look at him. His hands were shaking, but his voice was steady. There's a box, he said, in my father's study, hidden in the lower cabinet behind the liquor shelf. My breath caught. Eleanor took a step toward him. Daniel, stop. But he didn't. He turned to the officers. I don't know everything, but I know that box has records. Papers. Letters. His throat bobbed. And I've seen photos. A long, heavy pause. Then one of the officers nodded. We'll need to take a look. Robert's jaw tightened. This is ridiculous. But Eleanor didn't speak. She was pale. She already knew. The officers moved toward the study. Robert and Eleanor stayed frozen, their carefully built world crumbling around them. Margaret inhaled sharply, gripping my arm. A full minute passed. Then another. Finally, sir, an officer returned, holding a worn leather box. We're going to need you to come with us. Eleanor's breath hitched. Wait, Robert held up a hand, stopping her. Then he sighed, turning to me with something almost like admiration. I underestimated you. I said nothing, because I knew, deep down, he hadn't underestimated me. He had underestimated Daniel. The officers stepped forward, cuffing Robert's wrists. Eleanor's face was frozen in a mask of quiet devastation. Margaret let out a shaky breath. And just like that, it was over. Or at least, as over as something like this could ever be. 2 weeks later, I stood by the lake. The place where Josephine's body had been found. The wind was cold. The water was still. Daniel stood beside me, his hands in his pockets. His father had been formally charged. His mother had retreated from public life, her reputation in shambles. Justice had been served. But at what cost? Daniel sighed. Do you regret it? I thought about it. About everything we'd lost. Everything we'd uncovered. Then I shook my head. No, he nodded, staring at the water. Neither do I. We stayed there a moment longer. Silent. Reflecting. Then we turned and walked away. Because some ghosts deserved a rest. And some truths, no matter how painful, deserved to be set free.